You're listening to Succeed in Medicine, the show for practicing physicians who want to master the parts of their career and life that med school never prepared us for. From interpersonal skills to career navigation to the essential information every physician needs. I'm Dr. Bradley Block, and in every episode, we bring you brass tacks advice and immediately applicable insights from world-class experts, so you can feel prepared wherever your MD takes you and build a life in medicine that's sustainable, rewarding, and actually worth all those years of sacrifice.
Hello, everybody. This is John Schneider. I am guest host on the Succeed in Medicine podcast, and I'd like to thank Dr. Bradley Block for another opportunity to interview an incredible guest for our podcast. With me today is Rich Diviney, a former Navy SEAL commander, 20 years plus, who is now a performance consultant for high-performing teams. He's written two incredible books, The Attributes and Masters of Uncertainty. And I'd really like to welcome him. I think he's going to have a lot to share for us on uncertainty, who we are, how we can investigate who we are to become better performers, and how we can tackle uncertainty, which has always been present in medicine, but in recent years has become more present than perhaps we'd like. So, Rich, thank you so much for being here. This is amazing. Your books are amazing, and really appreciate you making the time.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to be here. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'd like to just kind of start out with the books, because I think it sets the stage for listeners about your journey to your Navy SEAL career and then into this performance consulting and advising. The Attributes, which I've read, incredible. And as a physician coach, I was really, really attracted to it because self-discovery is a big part of coaching. When I coach physicians, doing assessments is a really, really, really big part of this. You know this well in the work that you do. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the Attributes came to be for you?
Yeah, the baseline story started when I was put in charge of selection and training for one of our elite SEAL commands, SEAL Team 6, which is a separate, people really didn't know what SEAL Team 6 was at all until, of course, we rescue Philip Al bin Laden, and everybody knew. But it's a command that requires an extra selection process. So there's Navy SEAL training, which is very difficult. It's a 90% attrition rate just to become a Navy SEAL. To get to 6, you have to have been a SEAL for at least 5 years. You have to have stellar performance reviews and recommendations, and then physical tests and psychological tests. And then if you're picked out of that initial process, you go through a 9-month selection course is required. And only 50% of the guys make it through that course. So every selection course implies attrition. But what was the problem when I took over? So I went through that course in 2005, and then I took over the training course in 2010, and I was put in charge of it. And the problem we were facing was we were unable to articulate why guys weren't making it through. Okay. So we're saying something like, the guy couldn't shoot very well. But if you tell a Navy SEAL of that caliber he can't shoot very well, this is a guy who's probably shot more rounds than most people in the military. So it's disingenuous to him and us. And of course, leadership starts to ask some tough questions. And so they said, Rich, we need you to look into this and see what we're actually doing here. And so that's really when I began to understand and to recognize that there was a bifurcation between these skills, these visible things that we can see and measure and test, and show us that someone knows how to do the thing, and attributes, which tells us someone has the quality, they have what it takes to do the thing. And kind of a real visceral example of this for me was a older SEAL friend of mine, a SEAL instructor long before I'd gone through and, a basic SEAL training. And he said, Rich, there's a story about a kid who showed up to SEAL training one day, and he walked into the instructor's offices and said, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And the instructor said, okay, well, you have to do a swim test. And the kid said, okay, fine. So they took him out to the pool. It's a 50-meter swim. It's easy, 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. No big deal. Anyway, this kid gets all ready to go, proceeds to jump into the pool, and then proceeds to sink to the bottom of the pool. And at the bottom of the pool, he starts to walk across the bottom of the pool to one end, and he touches the one, and he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. And he comes up, and he's gasping for air, nearly drowning, and the instructor looks at him and says, what the heck are you doing? And the kid who's still trying to catch his breath looks at the instructor and says, I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim. And at that point, the instructor pauses. He looks at the kid and says, it's okay, we can teach you how to swim. Why did the instructor say that? And he said that because he knew if this kid had the qualities, attributes to show up to Navy SEAL training without knowing how to swim, he had everything inside of him that we needed for him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be easy. So I began to understand that there's a difference between skills and attributes. And attributes are those qualities that underpin our performance in all aspects of life, but especially during stress, challenge, and uncertainty. When the shit hits the fan, personality goes out the window. We know this. My wife is an example because she thinks it's funny because it's true. She's one of the kindest, bubbliest, most gregarious people you'll ever meet. When the shit hits the fan, that all goes out the window. And she's running on attributes as we all are. So the levels of these attributes, these qualities start to define our performance. And when we talk about these professions or environments, when you start talking about the military profession or the profession of medicine, you're talking about environments where you are in stress, uncertainty for the preponderance of that, which means if we don't understand how we're going to operate at our most raw, we are well behind the power curve in understanding our performance. And so that was the impetus of it. Came out of the Navy after doing that at 6 and recognized that this was something to write about and talk about. And so I wrote the book in 2021.
Thank you. I don't have the results in front of me, but for the listeners, you can go on theattributes.com and you can actually take this test, and it's phenomenal, kind of complementary to a lot of the other types of assessments that are out there. And so as a coach, it's something that, and maybe I'll talk to you later about this, but we might need to use it in some training that we do. But it's great that you brought that up. And I'll tell you, I hadn't had this on my list of questions, but one of the big themes in medicine, and so I'm an academic physician, meaning I train residents, I teach medical students. And so I see the training, right, that comes through, right? And one of the things that has been a theme throughout medicine, throughout the history of medicine, is this idea of competency. And you hit on it, can you do this? Is not the same question of perhaps how will you do this?
Yes.
Right. In the sense of what are you bringing? Like you said, what are you bringing with you that is perhaps innate?
And what's interesting, John, is that these attributes, so first of all, there's no judgments to where you, the idea is all of us have all 41 attributes. We all have all 41. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. So if we take adaptability, for example, I'm high on adaptability. I'm like 6 on adaptability. That means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow. They're still adaptable because all human beings are, but there's friction there. And so when we kind of line these attributes up on a wall like dimmer switches, all of us have different dimmer switch settings, and that starts to speak to our own unique performance. And so there's no good or bad. I will agree with you that we've found that the attributes assessment really buttresses almost all the other personality assessments, because those assessments are really great at showing people who they are in regular everyday life. But the attributes show you who you are at your most raw, and they're underpinning performance. And so this becomes really important and very interesting when you start matching against certain roles. Even within the medical profession, there are different attributes required. So we worked with and talked to a lot of ER docs and ER nurses. And ER docs and ER nurses are similar to SEALs in the sense we actually have too high empathy. We will not be able to do our jobs. You buy that. At the same time, your general practitioner, you want someone who has high empathy, who's your general practitioner, right? So even in the same, quote, field, different jobs, different roles require different levels of these attributes. And so there's no judgments. Your bottom 5 attributes are as important to your success as a human being as your top 5. You are as successful as a human being as much because of your bottom 5. All these attributes, your top and your bottom, come with blind spots. And to be aware of those also is actually important, right? You're high decisive, low patience. That's very advantageous in the way you move and make this. But a blind spot is you might make decisions too fast, enough information. So these are all things that provide what you're talking about as the self-awareness that allows someone to actually just understand and perform.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. One of the main questions came up in reading your books is, as you've moved out of the military and into this working with ER physicians or corporate clients, and from reading the books, it sounds like it's translated extraordinarily well. Are there differences, though, that you see in applying the attributes in those two settings, kind of in the military setting versus outside of the military space?
Well, there are differences, yes. However, they're not really what people think. It has less to do with the actual job and more to do with what's required for the actual job. And so just take ER docs and Navy SEALs. Okay. To be very basic about it, one group's job is to kill people. The other group's job is to save people, right? So they're completely different jobs in that sense. However, both jobs require a level of compartmentalization that is very unique and very precise. In other words, you have to be able to focus in on some specific thing and block out all other distractions until you're complete with that. You have to be compartmentalization is one of the most important qualities for both ER physicians and SEALs doing different jobs. And so the interesting aspect comes when you start understanding the attributes at their basic, and they're all neutral. There's no judgment, but understanding how they play into each job, each profession. And also the cool thing is how they cross contexts. And this is how one, and I talk to gals who get out of the military all the time. They spend 20, 25 years. It's very rare for someone to 20, 25 years doing something like climbing a mountain in 5 years, jump off that mountain and try to start climbing another mountain. But that's what the transitioning military service member does. But what I tell them is the attributes that allowed you to be successful in the military are going to allow you to be successful in some other endeavor. You want to see if you can match them a little bit, right? In terms of just the attributes you pick for the next endeavor, or the next endeavor should match your attribute set. Well, that means it'll feel right to you. But the courage is required, whether you're in the military or ER emergency room or courtroom or in a classroom. It's all the same. So
yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think in medicine and through the lens of coaching, it's interesting. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Medicine is a very linear path for the most part, right? College, medical school, residency, maybe a fellowship, and then practice. One of the biggest transitions that physicians make is when the path no longer becomes linear. When you start practicing, and there are boundaries, right? And there are norms and expectations that go along with the career, but you're free of this very kind of rigid path that had all the things about competency and graduation and all of these different things. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, especially young, early graduated physicians taking on their attending job, is the question, and why I thought interviewing you would be so good for everybody who's listening, is that it's one of the times when you start to understand yourself and you're forced to understand yourself in a really, really different way. And that's where I see these kinds of things like the attributes being so helpful. And I imagine that you see that in the work that you've done, obviously in the military, but also outside the military, in terms of those types of transitions for people.
100%. And I think you bring up such an excellent point, because the assumption sometimes is that some of these domains are so useful in everyday life, but academic prowess does not translate equally to life prowess, nor does athletic prowess translate into life prowess, because both niches are fairly defined and fairly disciplined, whether it be academic or athletic. And what we find in regular life is that the only discipline you're going to get in regular life is the stuff you make. It's very difficult to find a pathway that's just laid out for you. So the question is, what you draw from those experiences can then help translate to success in other domains. And part of this are understanding your attributes and what you bring to those domains, and then how you can work outside of that.
Right. Now, it's really, a colleague of mine who I'd love to have on this podcast, actually, surgeon like me, but did a PhD in education looking at professional identity, actually, which is a really, really fascinating topic. And it's kind of, I think a lot of physicians are struggling with this, right? In the sense of, with medicine changing as much as it is, and big swings and grant funding and all of these other things, people's identities are being threatened in a lot of ways, right? And that's common in all sorts of professions and lives and so on and so forth. And I see an opportunity here, and tell me if I'm wrong, but this is where I see something like the attributes being so, in a sense, protective. Because if you don't know yourself as well as you could, having not done something like the attributes, those threats are challenging, right?
They sure are. And you bring up another point, and I talk about this in the second book, and really the power of identity and how it drives our performance. And this idea that whatever we put after those two words drives our behavior in very meaningful, but also sometimes subtle ways. The idea, though, is the overall kind of thesis is that we, as humans, we collect identities as we go through life. And they can be benign all the way to very powerful. It can be, I went to this high school, I played the sports, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a doctor, I'm a Navy SEAL, I'm a Metallica fan. Whatever those are, you collect those along the way. And each one of those comes with behaviors dictate what it means to be in that identity. And we will behave towards whatever identity we prioritize in that moment. And so there are some very powerful ones. Doctor is a very powerful identity. Navy SEAL, very powerful identity. One of the problems we often have with guys getting out is that transition, is going from I'm a Navy SEAL to I am no longer a Navy SEAL. Because it's not like the Marine Corps. Marine Corps is pretty good about once the Marine, always a Marine. It's not the same. The SEAL teams is, you have this pin, the trident, is earn your trident every day. As soon as you put down that trident, you're no longer a Navy SEAL. You are a former Navy SEAL for sure, but you're not doing the job. And so that creates a dearth for many people, as it does, I imagine, in the physician world. Even if you see the environment changing, and suddenly the identity you thought was yours is no longer there. And so one of the things we have to be cognizant of is understanding what identities we carry, and then, kind of like you're insinuating, narrow them a little. It's just as easy to say I'm adaptable or I am resilient. And now you're tying identity to these attributes that are inherently yours, that are not going to change, can be solid groundwork for wherever your path takes you.
I love that point, because the idea of the I am statement, which I want to transition to here in a minute because I think it's really important. I am list of attributes is very, very, very different than I am define a profession.
Yes, 100%.
Maybe internal versus external to a certain degree. And we talk a lot now in medicine, in particular where I work, about transitions and change, because it is the theme of medicine, right? For lots and lots of reasons. Do you think when that identity, and this is going to lead us into the Masters of Uncertainty, I think, very nicely. Do you think when that identity is more externally defined versus more internally defined, that those transitions are more challenging?
I do, but maybe for reasons that are a little bit more subtle. And that is that, I'm a big believer in even the external identities provide rules, conditions, behaviors that define what being that identity is. And so these outcomes, even if it's externally produced, can become very powerful, but the environment matters. So Girl Scouts are a great example of this. Girl Scouts have the Girl Scout code, and regardless of where you go through your Girl Scout training, whatever part of the world, every Girl Scout learns this Girl Scout code. And these are basically rules for how to behave in life. And they're very codified and they're very identifiable in terms of this is how I behave. The good thing about the Girl Scouts is those behaviors are translatable and they can cross contexts very easily. I mean, the behaviors that Girl Scouts embody and imbue, you can apply them to any domain of life, regardless of what domain you're in. Where it gets tricky is, even though we do identify very viscerally with some of these behaviors that, say, a doctor, being a great doctor has, or being a great Navy SEAL has, the environment doesn't always support the conduct of the behaviors. And that's where we start feeling that loss, is because we've attached behaviors to a identity that is very easily lived in a specific environment. But once we're out of that environment, how do you live it? I mean, it's hard to live a Navy SEAL life when you're in CONUS on base and at home. It's just, there's certain principles to translate. Same thing with being a doctor or physician in certain domains. I think we just have to be cognizant that some of these external identities that we latch onto ourselves or embody, the environment is going to shift in a way that you are no longer going to be able to live to those principles, live to those rules. And that's where it gets tough. Making it more granular, like we've just talked about, can actually help solve that problem.
You've hit it spot on. It's a balance, right? It's a balance between the internal and external. We have those attributes. We are bringing, and there's other assessments that go into things like unconscious motivators or other aspects of who we are independent of environment or agnostic to environment. And then there are identities, I am statements that are very environment specific, right? And that we've dedicated ourselves to because we've thrown ourselves into being a teacher, a doctor, whatever it is. And we've internalized all of that because it is a big part of our identity. And so I think it's a really, really important point, because I think that the more, when, especially for our listeners, but really for anybody, when you feel that identity threat, look at both, right? Don't, because the loss aversion that can come with this idea that suddenly I can't do this thing that I've done can be extraordinarily threatening.
Yes.
Unless you turn to the things that you can carry to another space. And I think that's
the key right there. If you
Right.
understand attributes, you can build a new identity. And so what I did when I transitioned, when I was no longer a Navy SEAL, first of all, I had a very powerful identity to fall back on. That's husband and father, because my husband and father identity was always predominant.
Mhm.
Sometimes the Navy SEALs predominant, but you know, for
Right.
me, it was, always husband and father. But then I was able to say, you know what, I'm going to build a new identity. My new identity is going to be an author. I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to build that. So I'm still building those identities, but it's a new challenge, new mountain to climb. And I think that gives us drive, that gives us purpose, that gives us inspiration.
Yeah. It's a great segue into Masters of Uncertainty, because I think that when you're facing uncertainty, and this is another huge theme right now, I think in the world generally,
Yeah.
right? But in medicine in particular, because of pretty drastic changes that are happening on whether it's financial, whether it's from a science perspective, whether it's from a payer perspective, all of these different things, physicians are feeling an uncertainty crunch. I think in a way that at least feels new. It may not be completely new. We certainly, during COVID, physicians faced something existential, I think, in a lot of ways. Everybody did. But that was a big identity threat for people in the beginning of what physicians and nurses and medical assistants and everybody, of this idea that I dedicated my life to this, yet I could die,
Right.
which is not something that's always been present in medicine. I think
Right.
you can speak to that in
Sure,
terms
sure,
of
yeah.
your experience, obviously. But let me ask you this, because I think what drew you to writing about uncertainty? Because I think that'll help us understand the book a little
Well,
bit.
honestly, the Masters of Uncertainty is the book that I've always wanted to write. I've had on my line for years and years and years. I happened to write tributes first, which is a little bit of a unconscious genius in a way, because it's such a large topic that to be able to kind of write that first, because the attributes is part of the uncertainty. But so ultimately, when I went through Navy SEAL training, when you go through something like that, and this basic underwater demolition / SEAL training, but just the basic SEAL training where regular sailors go to become Navy SEALs, 90% attrition rate of buds. And I remember going through SEAL and coming out of that, and we had started with about 180 people, but we graduated about 35 of us. And looking around and saying to myself, how the heck am I still here? And ultimately, the quick follow-on question is, why the heck am I still here? And I looked around at the guys around me. I just felt like it was a little bit of what I call a healthy imposter syndrome. It's like, what am I still doing here? But what I recognize is that when I really got to know these guys, and this kind of stayed the course throughout my career, which just made me do better and want to be better. But also I recognized that most of the other guys around me were asking the same question. How am I still here? So what I began to be fascinated with was how we were able to march into these environments of deep stress and challenge and danger, if you will, and perform the way we, just the same way the guy next to me was doing it. So the answers were somewhere in me as much as they were outside of me. And that's really what I began to focus in on and become interested in, this idea of what it takes to master uncertainty.
Great. Yeah. I mean, the book appealed to me, and not just because I kind of live in this world of helping physicians, but because personally I felt that there are moments, and I'm not going to project this on anybody else, but certainly moments in my career of the same thing, right? Like taking on that new surgical case that you've read about, you've done a lot of training on, but maybe it's the first time you're doing it on your own, or a technical innovation that is new and we're trying, or it's just a really complicated tumor that you're taking out of a place that is really dangerous for somebody, and the heaviness of that, right, in terms of this person's life, their function, their quality of life, all of those things that run through your head. So I will say, reflecting back Am I a lot better at it now? Yeah, sure, obviously. But that's 12 years of experience, and certain blood, sweat, and tears a little different than what you had to go through, obviously. So maybe overcoming fears and overcoming anxieties, largely based in uncertainty. What's going to be the outcome? And so I think physicians relate to this in a big way because the decisions are easy, but the outcome's uncertain. And so mentally wrapping your head around that is often very difficult. And I think a lot of people get paralyzed by the outcome, which is why this idea of the DPO was so fascinating. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about that? Because I think it's a very powerful cognitive heuristic for folks.
If you like this podcast episode, you're going to love the other shows over at the Doctor Podcast Network. For instance, The Scalpel and Sword, hosted by Dr. Lee Nagendran Sharma, a previous guest on this show, who discussed conflict resolution. Covers topics like industrial psychology and personal development, ethics, and you guessed it, conflict resolution in healthcare. Check out Scalpel and Sword.
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to do is lay out what we're talking about in terms of, and that is uncertainty really at its basic level is just the state of not knowing, if you will. We just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So uncertainty at its face is not necessarily a bad thing. It's when you combine uncertainty with certain things that you get bad stuff. And really what we're talking about is fear. Fear is what restricts, withholds people and gets people into a tizzy and gets people frozen or acting without thinking. So when I got out of the Navy, I linked up with a guy we became fast friends named Andrew Huberman. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist out of Stanford University, has a popular podcast now.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I began working on this together. He was running a fear lab at the time. And one of the things we hypothesized was that fear is a combination of two factors. The factors are uncertainty plus anxiety, meaning if you don't have those two factors, you don't necessarily have fear. You can be uncertain or you can be anxious, but not uncertain. I got to give a presentation next week to my colleagues. I know my colleagues. I know the presentation. There's no uncertainty there. I'm just a little anxious. No fear. You can be uncertain without being anxious. That's every kid on Christmas Eve. We know there's no fear there. Once you combine the two, that you get fear. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about this type of uncertainty is the uncertainty plus the anxiety that equal fear. So really the ultimate way that you march through this type of uncertainty, mitigate that fear, is you buy down either one or both of those combining elements, and or you buy down uncertainty. Oftentimes you do both. Anxiety, buying down anxiety, again, anxiety at its face is fiction because anxiety is always in the future. So is what we think is going to happen, but hasn't. Now, the stress that anxiety creates is very much present, okay? And that obviously generates an autonomic arousal, which can lead to amygdala hijack or autonomic overload where your frontal lobe is going offline and you're limbically biased in your decision-making. That's not where we want to be. We want to have that frontal lobe engaged at all times. So some of the ways we can buy down anxiety, we already know. There's respiratory tools, there's visual tools. You can bring down your anxiety level, bring the frontal lobe back. Now, how do we buy down uncertainty? This is when we start talking about how our brain processes the environment around us. Because our brains are certainty-seeking machines, they are always trying to figure out the environment. Many times, most of the time, through three primary aspects. And those aspects are duration, how long this is going to last, pathway, and then outcome. What's the end state here? If we are in absence of one or more of those, we begin to feel uncertainty and therefore anxiety and stress and all this. We'll just take illness as an example because it's a great one. We're talking about medicine. Strep throat is an illness that we all know. There's a antibiotics. Okay. So if we get strep throat, we know the pathway antibiotic, we know the outcome, going to get better. What we don't know is duration, because it might take me 2 days to react to the antibiotics, might take 3, whatever that is. So our anxiety, our uncertainty level is mild. Now let's take flu. Flu also, at least in today's environment, most people don't die from the flu. We survive it, but there's no known cure for the flu, even though a bunch of people have crazy ideas of what you can, nothing codified. So we get the flu now, we're in absence of two things. Okay, we're in absence of pathway, what to do, and duration. We know we're going to get better. We know the outcome, but we're absent. So our anxiety, our uncertainty level is now moderate. Now let's imagine a disease shows up or a virus shows up. We've never seen it before. There's no known vaccine or cure. Some people are dying, some people are not dying. It's spreading around the globe. We don't know what the end state is. This is why we felt the way we did in 2020, because we were duration. What DPO is, what the tool is called moving horizons. And what moving horizons does is allows us to, in a moment of uncertainty, to ask ourselves, what do I know? What can I control? Pick a horizon to focus on, and is, in essence, generate our own duration pathway outcome. You generate your own certainty. So a really simple example would be SEAL training. In Navy SEAL training, you have to run around with big, heavy boats in your head constantly. For all the way in Hell Week, you're constantly running with these things. And so I remember it was 3 a.m. during Hell Week and running on the beach with this boat on my head, and we're all miserable. And I remember we were running next to a sandburn. I had myself focused on getting to the end of the sandburn. And what I did, unbeknownst to me, is I picked a horizon. Doing so created a duration pathway outcome. Duration from now until end of sandburn, pathway from here to end of sandburn, and outcome end of sandburn. Now, by doing that, I manipulated my own internal dopamine reward system. I created enough dopamine to get me moving along the path of the goal, because that's what dopamine does. It motivates us to move. And I also created a small reward at the end of the accomplishment that allowed me, once I accomplished that goal, to come back out, ask the question again, what do I focus on now? Pick a new horizon. So DPOing and moving horizons is simply a process of chunking in environments, kind of the neurological equivalent of eating the elephant one bite at a time, but we're with our environments. And now these horizons are very subjective to both the individual and the intensity of the environment. The more intense the environment, for example, the shorter the horizon. I remember, in SEAL training, freeze you in the surf zone for hours, right? I wrote freezing in the surf zone and said to myself, I'm just count 5 waves. That was my horizon. Sometimes my horizon would make it to the next. Sometimes it was going to make it to the end of the sandburn. But we have to pick our own horizons, and it's subjective to us. We have to pick something that's too far, because if we pick something that's too far, what happens is we run out of dopamine before we get there and we quit. Anytime we quit anything because we run out of dopamine, we don't have any more. The horizon was too much of the elephant. If we pick something too close, too short, we're not going to receive that dopamine reward. We're not going to feel it. And so it's really about understanding what that modulation is. And it's a horizon that's just outside the comfort zone, but not too far, not too hard. And this is the process. This moving horizons is exactly how every single performer marches effectively through uncertainty, challenge, and stress. And those who are masters of it, we do it without thinking. In other words, as soon as the environment turns uncertain, turns chaotic, we immediately start doing this stuff without thinking. We just chunk it. And we start, well, it's funny because I live in a neighborhood here in Virginia Beach. We've lived here for years. Across the street from me is a SEAL. Down the road to the right is the SEAL, and down the road to the left. And I remember my wife said, I'm so glad these guys are in the neighborhood. And I said, why? And she said, because if anything happened, I could go to them and they'd act like you act. And I said, what do you mean by that? It's like, as soon as the shit hits and all you guys do is you just have to work at the problem. You just go boom, boom. You just work it from point to point. And that's what we do. We just calm ourselves down. We start working the problem. That's all we're talking about. So it's actually a very simple tool, but we just have to start practicing it so it becomes more innate.
And really, what struck me about the book, it was a fantastic book, really. But one of the big parts is this idea of practice, because it links back to this idea of professional identity. And I think I've long been, I don't know if I ever told you this, I was going to be an economist. I wanted to get my PhD in economics. And I was interested in human behavior. So here I am interviewing human behavior experts. But the cognition always fascinated me. And I really want to make this point to our listeners, this idea that we're stuck with our cognition, or this idea that we can't change it. And I think your book really brings light this idea that you can change it. Right? You can change it in the immediate term by changing your horizon, but you can also practice this to be more adaptable in lots of different situations. And sometimes I'm speaking to myself a little bit here. We don't give ourselves enough credit for being able to do that and I think, tell me if I'm wrong, that sometimes that's because maybe we set the horizon way too far out. Oh, it's too big, right? It's insurmountable because you recognize that it's a challenge, whether it's accomplishing something in your career, or whether it's a physical demand, whatever it may be, an illness, perhaps, right? But we've catastrophized it. We've moved that horizon to some kind of level of perfection that is perhaps unattainable, or uncertain.
Well, in the neurological sense, it's beyond our dopamine capacity.
Right.
It's interesting. They started doing exit interviews at SEAL training probably now 6, 7, 8 years ago, which is amazing. They should have been doing this all the time. But in other words, they interviewed guys to quit, said, okay, what happened? Why'd you quit? And it was amazing because 9 times out of 10, it was the same story. And the story went something like, we had been doing this for so long, we were still doing it. And as I thought forward, I couldn't imagine for another, what you named the time frame. And it was all focused on this idea that these guys were unable to stop thinking too far ahead and start focusing on the moment. And again, that next moment is very personalized in terms of the distance, because those distances are so, I'm going to take 10 breaths right now. It could be whatever that is. But what's interesting about this, John, is that what this process does is actually it mitigates and dissipates fear. Because people ask me before, they've said, hey, can you think of a time where you were in a situation where you really felt, oh my gosh, my life is in real danger, like you were afraid? And honestly, I don't say this with any arrogance answers, but not because it's an arrogant answer. It's because in those moments, all we were doing was working the problem. We were just focused on what we had to focus in the moment. Now, what's interesting about that is it happened a few times where after everything was done, we were back on base, the reports had been filed, all that stuff. I was back in my own little hooch by myself. I would think back and I would feel the fear come, oh my God, that was so close. And feel the fear that I should have felt in the moment, but I didn't have time to feel the moment. I came back. So maybe we put the fear on the shelf and then process it differently. But this is not an uncommon thing. We humans do this without thinking quite a bit. In fact, I was watching an interview with Buzz Aldrin. The interviewer was saying, hey, when you and Neil Armstrong, you're in that lunar module, you're coming down for a landing. None of this has been done before. You don't know if it's going to work. Even if you land successfully, you don't even know if you'll take off again. You might be trapped on the moon forever. Were you afraid? And you're saying, no, because we were just working what we had. We were doing everything we had to do. And we were worried about the task in front of us, and going step by step, fear goes away. And so truly is the secret. And the good news, like you said, because of this little thing called neuroplasticity, is 6. We in fact practice this and get better. And the real good news is you don't have to be uncertainty to practice moving horizons. Most of us do this in the gym every day anyway. When we go to the gym, we're not thinking about the entire workout. Okay, I'm going to do my biceps and I'm going to break that into 4 exercises. I'm going to just focus on this. So you can practice moving horizons in any environment, exercise that muscle. So when uncertainty does hit, you're actually really good.
Phenomenal. I want to talk about one more thing, because I think this is really important. Part of this is about leaders. I think the attributes and masters of uncertainty, a lot of leadership pieces that are really, really important. I think in medicine, leadership is a very big topic, and it's a very, very central topic because it's a big system. Yeah. Whether it's in one hospital, whether it's, a hospital system, whether it's a practice, it doesn't matter, right? Group dynamics plus big organizations, the whole thing. One of the key things that I really took away from your book is this idea of dynamic subordination. And I know we're getting a little off topic, but I do think that it's really worth it for the listeners to understand this, because I think that physicians in general are their own leaders in a lot of ways, right? We've spent this time talking about learning your attributes, learning how to deal with uncertainty, making decisions, changing horizons, all of these other things. Where I think it naturally takes us is then how do you relate to others?
Yeah.
In the presence of uncertainty and varying attributes. And so I was really struck by this concept of dynamic subordination that you observed in your teams, from my understanding of the books. And I thought we could talk a little bit about that and how it's changed your view of leadership and how you can help others understand this.
Yeah, I think first thing we have to understand about leadership is that it's not a position. It's a behavior. Okay? Being in charge is a position. Leadership is a behavior. And the other sobering fact we have to understand is we're not allowed to self-designate. We call ourselves leaders. That's like calling yourself good looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you are someone they want to follow based on the way you behave. So that's one thing. We have to behave in a way that allows people the decision to say, I want to follow this person. That all comes from are attributes. I mean, those elemental behaviors. Number two is that the highest performing teams, they don't task organize along a model that's known or common that we see. It's not the pyramid that we're used to. It's not the flat line. It's not even the upside down servant leadership model. But what it more is like an amoeba. And what that amoeba is an environment where problems and challenges and issues can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who's closest to the problem and the most competent immediately steps up and takes, and everybody follows and supports. And then the environment shifts and someone else takes lead and everybody follows and supports. It's what we call dynamic subordination. And this is exactly how the highest performing teams operate, to include surgical team. I was talking to a very successful heart surgeon, and he worked in these very intense surgical environments. And one of his rules in that room was no titles. It was all first name, because he wanted to make sure that every single person in that room felt empowered to speak up when it was their turn, when they had to step up or if they saw something wrong. And it's way different to say, doctor, that's wrong, versus, hey, John, that's wrong. And so but he used to try to set that environment. So dynamic subordination is, and as an officer, I was an officer of the SEAL teams. I went on hundreds of missions and combat missions, and I was in charge of every one. It didn't mean I was always being supported. In fact, most of the time it was the opposite. I was supporting other people. Sometimes the environment would shift and they would be in support of me, but it was all environmentally based, which tells us something, and that is that our position on a team has nothing to do with our rank. Our position on a team has everything to do with what we are there to contribute to the team. And the best leaders, the person in charge who is seen as a leader, their biggest job is to create and set that environment, to set the environment so that the team understands this is how we operate. That's how the highest performing teams operate. That's how they operate in a fast, efficient, effective manner, because you have the best foot getting put forward every single time. Everybody's there to support. And so dynamic subordination is simply, and I'm glad you brought it up, it's actually not a segue. It's not off topic at all, because this is how teams master uncertainty. You cannot master uncertainty as a team if you're not dynamically subordinating, because that person who's closest to the problem, guess what they're doing? They're setting the horizon for everybody in that moment.
Right.
Now that the horizon has changed, someone else has to set a new horizon. Constantly dynamic subordination. So it's a way you task organize if you want to master uncertainty as a team.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And I think that the idea of teams in medicine, I'm a surgeon, and what you said about the heart surgeon rings true for me. We've implemented this. I mean, it was a sea change in medicine to go from nobody spoke in the operating room except the doctor to teams that actually communicate with each other, right? I mean, that was a sea change in medicine, and we learned it from other industries. And there's still challenges with it. There's still big normative shifts that have to happen where, the two letters after your name may carry more status than somebody else's two letters. But when you're really talking about teamwork, we don't advance as physicians, as practices, as organizations, and probably as a healthcare system without understanding this better. We just don't. And in the changing landscape of medicine, I think this is a key aspect, because taking care of people the right way and the best way isn't a solo act. You gotta have a team around you.
Well, and the other thing, regardless of the industry, even in the SEAL teams, my new guy might have the best idea. If I don't give him an opportunity, a voice to step up and at least offer it, we're missing out on a perspective that would have been very, very valuable. And so I think any domain can draw some value from this type of concept, at least understanding that, hey, everybody on that team matters. And it's our job as the person in charge, if we want to be leaders, to bring that out.
Yeah, phenomenal. I could talk to you for hours, and I hope to continue the conversation. Anything else you could like to leave for our listeners about what we've talked about, or ideas that they should pursue?
Well, I would just say this, and it really comes down to why I love doing this work, why I'm inspired to do this work. And that is, these tools, these concepts will allow for people, if practiced, allow for people to deal with uncertainty and challenge and stress when it hits us without warning, because it always will. That means there's one certainty in life that'll hit us. And these tools will allow us to deal better with that when it does. The real exciting part, however, is that when you get really good at this, you begin to deliberately step into uncertainty. And this is where all of our growth, all of our evolution, all of our discovery lies, outside of our comfort zone. This is exactly why and how we've gone from cave dwellers to space explorers, is because we're wired to do this, and we have to step outside our comfort zone. And so when you are in a position where you have the confidence Say, you know what? I'm going to try this. I'm going to step outside my comfort zone. I'm going to do it. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know I'll just deal with it on the way. You unlock potential that you never otherwise would have been able to explore. And that's what's exciting to me. So
phenomenal. Well, thank you so much for this. And to our listeners, please look up theattributes.com, the book, The Attributes, and the book, Masters of Uncertainty. I promise you, you will learn a ton and it will set you on a great path for growth, as Rich has said. So thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means either you fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please write us a 5-star review, take a screenshot, and email it to me so I can send you a quick guide on how to earn patient trust in 20 seconds or less. Email me at brad@physiciansguidetodoctoring.com and feel free to suggest a topic or guest. I take your requests seriously. The views expressed on this episode are those of the interviewer and the interviewee and do not represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting makes it sound like I'm talking directly to you, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or legal advice, or really any advice. Thanks again for listening to Succeed in Medicine.